So we did the restoration, which obviously cost a lot of money. We got bank debt, which is not easy for a startup. Then we opened and no one came. You need some luck. Every single element I messed up. I learned so much just from that one company, which was a failure.
So let's move to Home House, because that was the televised Trouble at the Top show.
So my first business was a success, but you do learn more, I think, in business from your failures. But my first business was a success. The second, I've had about 100. The second one was a failure. But Home House, through my chess connections, actually, I met a lovely fellow called Brian Cleavas, who used to run a very well-known restaurant on the Strand called Simpson's on the Strand. And he always wanted to start a private members club. And this is sort of 1995, so 30 years ago. And he'd been around looking for buildings, where to do it, because it wasn't really, all the clubs then were sort of stuffy, stodgy military clubs, or, and so he wanted to do a nice one. And he founded this building, which is called Home House, which is a Georgian masterpiece. I mean, it dates back from like 1780 something, and it's got an amazing history. It really is a beautiful building. It's like the Palace of Versailles. It's got these ornate ceilings with, artwork all over the place and gold leafed walls and all that. It's a big building, about 40,000, two houses next to each other, about 40,000 square feet. And he had this idea of turning it into a members club with a restaurant, hotel rooms up the top, drawing rooms where you just sit and relax, a gym down the bottom, all this kind of, a bar, and which really sounded fun. But this is me in Monaco, where I'm just like, I got my boat, got my Ferrari, like club, yeah, club sounds fun, He showed me the idea, and I agreed to fund half of it, as long as he could raise the other half. But I had a couple of conditions, because when I was running a fund, it was in Bermuda, and I went to New York a lot, and you'd go in the Four Seasons Hotel or something. You could go like this, you'd maybe go in a pair of jeans, but I'd come to London on business and I'd stay at wherever, and I want to go to the bar, and they're like, got to wear a tie. I'm like, are you for sea? And then I think I went to a couple of these military soldiers clubs or something, and there's an old man asleep in the corner, I'm like, what is this business model, right? We can't do that. I said, oh, well, I'll do it, but I've got conditions, and it sounds radical, but Brian is quite conservative, and I said, no dress code. No dress code. Like, no dress code, mobile phones, dogs. This is just we're gonna do the opposite of what you expect. You've got this beautiful building, and we're just gonna let people have fun. And we're not gonna be weighted all men, and it's gonna be men and women, And there's ways to do that. Not, you can't grab them off the street and drag them in, but you can have have things like reasonably priced house wine, and you have an environment where women don't feel threatened by, anyway, all that kind of detail. But I said, so no dress code. It was a struggle. We did the restoration, and it took 2 years restoring it, because the building was on an endangered building list. It was a very important building, but it was dilapidated. And so I became friends. It's owned by the Portman estate. We got a long lease, but I became friends with Lord Portman, Christopher Portman, by doing this building, because it lifted up the whole. This is in the mid-90s, when there was a bit of a recession, and this lifted up that whole area just north of Oxford Street. But so we did the restoration, which obviously cost a lot of money. We got bank debt, which is not easy for a startup. Then we kind of opened, and no one came. So you got 18 bedrooms, and you got to hire 100 people. That's one thing I talk about in business is disruption, discovery, and defense. So my disruption in that business was disrupting by being a beautiful building, but a very relaxed dress code and a fun place to be. Nothing stuffy. The discovery is testing that idea. So there's and people talk about. I'll just digress on my business theory a bit. People like to talk about unique selling point, but I don't like that term, because you can disrupt by either price or product. So in this case, it was product, but you can disrupt without having anything unique. If I'm selling, cappuccino at half the price of everyone else, that's not unique. That's not unique. It's competing on price. So you can compete on price or product, and one involves innovation, the other one involves imitation. But anyway, we were competing on product. But the problem was, it would be so easy now, because it was such a beautiful building. In the world of social media now, you just put something on TikTok or Instagram, blah, blah, blah. People would see these bedrooms, which are absolutely phenomenal. And no one even, we were just trying to get an article in Country Life, the odd thing in Hello magazine. It was or a deal with Centurion American Express. It was really tough to get to get people to come. The BBC were making a show called Trouble at the Top about businesses which were starting and presumably having trouble. We were just trouble. We weren't at the top. And they made a sort of 40-minute documentary about Brian trying to get this club open and me being all nervous because the money's going. So we struggled to get this going. Prince Charles then came to the opening. So it was a thing, right? I remember saying to him, shaking his hand, and he's saying thank you for doing the building. And I think my convict ancestors would have been a bit surprised that I'm sitting here talking to you about a building. Anyway, but it really, the world turns, right? You need some luck, a statistical event to go your way, and I can challenge you to find any business story which does not have an element of luck in there. And whenever I read someone saying how great they've done something, I'm immediately like, okay, where was it? Facebook. He hacked into the Harvard system. He wouldn't be allowed to do that now. It's just you need some good fortune. Home House needed something. So if we'd have had social media, we would have been all right, I think. But fortunately, somehow Madonna heard about Home House, and she came and stayed for a week. And then it was quite funny. She said, "Oh, I don't want anyone to know I'm here," so we didn't let anyone know she was there. And then they leaked it to the press because they wanted the publicity. But it was fantastic for Home House. And that was kind of the tipping point. After that, we became a cool place. So, and what I was saying before, when you open a business like Home House, because it's got all those facilities, it really needed 100 people. And talking about discovery cost, with a lemonade stand, you can just, there's no discovery cost. You do it in half an hour and you go and find out if that's a viable business. With something like that, the discovery cost and the discovery period is really long. So we're already like 5 million in, and a year in before you even know if the idea is any good. And so it's got restaurants very high discovery costs, and there's nothing worse than when you run out of money. I've seen it happen all the time. Discovery is when most early businesses, if they go wrong then, because you don't get to test the idea. And there's nothing more frustrating, because I think it's like a research project, that part of the business. You're just trying to see if something's viable, but so often you run out of money because of bad news bias or because you've underestimated how long it's going to take. And you sort of die without knowing. You end up the business fails even though it was a good idea. And I've seen that happen because you don't have enough money or you overspend. And that looked like it could happen with Home House. It was a good idea. There was Soho House and us who were doing the casual dress model. No one else had done it. It was quite different then. So we could have failed. It looked like we were going to fail, and I thought, at least we've done up a beautiful building. It's more fun than when a software business fails. You just got some code you throw away, but at least we've done something good. Anyway, Madonna came and stayed, and then it was all in the press, and then people started to think it was cool, and then people started to come, and then it slowly took off. So we ended up selling it in the end. We got offered a price, and a very good price. It was I think it was 2006, I don't know. It was when it was a good time to get some cash. And that's the problem with small companies, there's no liquidity. So when there's a buyer, you can't choose when you're going to sell. A lot of the time it's dictated by the market and by events.
If you want to find out how to buy a business successfully, get your free business buying toolkit. The link is in the video description below.
The second business, I'll tell it much faster because otherwise, so on the back of that, I thought business is really easy, and I play a lot of tennis, and I thought, we probably all have this thing where you look at a pair of tennis shoes or whatever, and you go, well, that doesn't cost that much. Tennis racket, £100, no way. Like a pair of shoes. Anyway, so I thought, and I was living in Monaco playing tennis at the Monte Carlo Country Club, beautiful place to play tennis. And I thought, I'm going to start this is in 2000-ish, I'm going to start a tennis racket company, and I'm going to bust this whole myth apart. Right? So, like big picture thinking. So I started the tennis racket company. I researched. I basically found there was two questions: how much would it cost to produce a racket, and are they protected by patents? And it was fine. I found a factory which actually made one of the best-selling rackets in the world. I got to them. I could make a tennis racket, a very high-quality tennis racket, even better than that racket, for about £15. And there's nothing about patents. They try to pretend sometimes there's some little thing on a tennis racket. Forget it. It's a piece of, Anyway, so I started a tennis racket company, which I called Mega Age, because this was going to be mega. I learnt so much just from that one company, which was a failure. So, because the idea, it's like I was talking about before, the idea was a good idea. My execution was so bad. I missed every element. Every single element I messed up, and then I'm like, it was a harsh lesson. You know, failure is a cruel teacher. but so I thought I was so confident in this tennis racket company. I'm like, I'm going to sell these at cost, and I'm going to the profit, if you like, the profit margin is going to be in brand name. I'm going to build up this mega age brand, so it's valuable. You know, I'm not going to make any money out of this, but I don't need to, and I put like $250,000 into this thing, and I'm going to make this work. You know. And I thought the tennis rackets were amazing. I got some prototypes, and I thought I'm going to sell them for $20. My cost £20 by the time we get them to the UK. And I thought, and I was just so confident. I was like, every time someone sees one of these rackets, 5 people are going to buy them. I'm like, okay, 5. I'm like 5, 25, 125, 625. I'm not going to have enough rackets, right? This is before I'd sold one, right? So it's good to be naive, right? So optimism is another thing. It's good to be optimism a mild bit. Anyway, so I'm like, I'm just going to spend all that money on tennis rackets. So I had like 10,000 tennis rackets made, and I had 5,000 in the States, 5,000 in London. I'm like, I'm just going to, you know, Yonex and Head are going to go broke. Like I was just like, and then I'm friends with Pat Cash, another Aussie who won Wimbledon in 1987. He loved the racket, and so he was sort of advising me on the specs and all that kind of stuff. And he was playing with it on the senior circuit, and he loved it. And so then I designed the colours, and I'm like Australian Aboriginal because I'm partly Aboriginal, a tiny bit. I did like red, yellow, and black for the colours of the Aboriginal flag. I'm like, this is fantastic, good strings, comes with strings. And then I advertised, in those days, it was only in the newspaper, so I had these little ads, Pat Cash in love, and the trick was that he was in love with the tennis racket. And we got some reviews in tennis magazines, which would say how great it was for value, but it didn't work. So when we put ads in, obviously I'm spending money to put those ads in, the Financial Times and the Times, you know, I'd sell like 20 rackets and, you know, but it didn't take off. I'm like, at that point, I must have had the biggest private tennis racket collection in the world, for sure, right? And they're not selling. And I remember doing the reverse maths. Instead of 5, 25, 125, I'm going, hang on, 40 a week? Like, I'm going to die before I get through these rackets, right? And it's not accelerating, you know? And then I'm trying to figure out, so if we didn't place the ads, and the ads are like 40 or 50 pounds, you know, we didn't sell any. I'm like, what's going on? And then we're getting these emails from these sort of, 2-bit tennis coaches, you know, not Pat Cash, saying these rackets are no good or this is no good. And then I remember, like having studied economics, there's a thing called given goods, where it's a reverse supply curve. What that means is if you make something cheap, people think it's rubbish. They just immediately are suspicious. You know, I'm like, I didn't even think of that, even though I'd studied that. You know, so people think Rolls Royces are good because they're expensive, and something cheap doesn't always sell. So people would automatically assume it was no good. And the other thing I didn't realise was that my cool colours, black, yellow, and red, are the German flag. So all the Brits just see this German colours, so they're getting complaints, can you change your colour? And I've like, already got 10,000 rackets in that colour. I can't, right, what am I going to do? So I made just about every mistake, and I managed to sell the racket company at a big loss. But the trouble is, that's what I'm talking about before. I never got to discover if that idea was viable. And, you know, in a way, I mean, I'm not the only one, because, you know, like Uber I don't know if they're making a profit yet, but they made a loss for a long time. Netflix made, you know, this idea of grabbing, you know, real estate, you know, land grab while you're making a loss is now sort of business theory. So my idea of land grab, you know, getting the tennis racket market was a good idea. It's just my execution was so bad. And now I call them infinite startups. You know, you're getting these companies, and often some of my companies come up with what I call infinite startups as competition. You know, I call them infinite startups. Something like they're prepared to take losses for almost infinity. And the idea is that they just grab, you know, and if Ricky comes up against this, Ricky's business comes up, someone just undercutting, no interest in making money, just to own the market, and I call them infinite startups. And so I had that idea, which was a good idea, but the execution was terrible. So I learned so much more from that than I did from Home House. Mistakes are a great way to learn, but it's very hard to learn in business, you know, apart from reading my book. It's very hard to learn because it's randomness, you know. So as a chess player or maths guy, you know, I had to unlearn a lot of things. I was almost a professional chess player. I ended up playing in a couple of chess Olympiads later on, right? But in chess, it's deterministic. You know, if you don't make a mistake, you won't lose. Whereas when I went into finance, I had to unlearn that, because you can do the right idea, but the randomness, you'll lose money. So it's a bit more like backgammon, or bridge, or some card game. And it's the same in business. And for example, I've backed 7 or 8 semiconductor companies, and which are very big discovery costs. You've got to get the chip made. You've got to, it takes 50, 100 people to design a chip and have it fabricated. But one worked and gave me 15, paid for all the others. But when I analysed it, that one that worked, there was nothing in retrospect that would have told me which one was going to work. So it's very hard to learn, even in retrospect, to learn to be a good manager. So management is such an underrated skill, and that's one of the tough things about business.